Welcome everyone to our first music webinar with Junior Cycle for Teachers. My name is Ethel and I'm delighted to be here along with my colleagues from the music team to take you through this webinar tonight, which is entitled Exploring the Music Specification, Practical Strategies for Planning, Part 1. Please be mindful that if the audio quality is causing some problems for you, it could be linked to the strength of your Wi-Fi connection. We would suggest a reboot and we'd be very welcome to come and join us again. Depending on what device you are joining us with, you will see a window that looks like this when you log on. If you're on your iPhone or your iPad, take a look at the screen on the left. If you are joining us tonight on PC, you will see your screen here in the middle of our slide. There is a control panel that you can expand and collapse by clicking the red arrow on the top right-hand corner of your screen. Then finally, if you are logging on using a Samsung or any other tablet device, your screen will look like this. Dialogue and interaction will form a really important and an integral part of our engagement with you tonight. So I would like to invite you all to post your comments and your questions if they arise as we journey through our talk together. To post any comments or questions, please follow the red arrow relevant to your device shown here. We will pause at key moments throughout this talk to deal with any questions you may have. Following our event this evening, this webinar will be posted on the music section of our website, www.jct.ie. You might find it useful to have to hand a copy of the Junior Cycle Music Specification, our Learning Outcomes poster, and action verbs poster, which we will reference during the webinar. Again, all of these resources are available on our website. However, if you have attended a JCT Music Cluster Day, you will find these resources, particularly the action verbs poster and the learning outcomes poster, in the back pages of your booklet that you received on that day. The topic of this webinar arose from the many valuable questions and rich dialogue we experienced working with you, our music colleagues, at our cluster workshops to date. Your engagement and participation in these workshops has provided us, the JCT music team, with a number of emerging specific areas which we have chosen to address tonight in this webinar. Some of these areas include questions, many questions such as, what are learning outcomes? How might I unpack a learning outcome? What are elements? What are strands? How do I create a unit of learning? How can the learning be linked across these strands? Why do I evidence the learning? And of course, we've all heard this one, the most popular one of all. Can you please suggest some templates for planning? So, working with you tonight during this webinar, we will explore practical strategies in how to engage with our specification, how you might unpack a learning outcome, how you might start to build a unit of learning by taking into consideration some key thoughts before you start planning. And these are thoughts and conversations that we shared together during our cluster workshops to date. How to organize the learning outcomes by linking the learning across the three interconnected strands. Suggestions as to how you might start planning for September 2018. And as always, we keep looking forward to what the next steps might be. Let's start with hearing from you first with this following question. What aspect of the new music specification are you most looking forward to engaging with? Please post your comments now in the questions tab that you will have seen relevant in the earlier slide. We will share your comments and your answers with everyone attending when we have our first check-in a little later on. Please feel free to post any other questions you might have throughout the webinar, and our colleagues here on the music team will endeavour to answer them for you. I would now like to invite my colleague Michelle to take you through the next sections. Hiya, Michelle.
Hi, Ethel, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be working with you all this evening. So let's start with exploring our music specification. Junior cycle music has been designed for a minimum of 200 hours of timetable student engagement across the 3 years of junior cycle. The learning that will take place during these 200 hours is contained in 36 learning outcomes. These 36 learning outcomes are organised into 3 interconnected strands, as you can see here from our learning outcomes poster. The 3 strands are procedural knowledge, innovate and ideate, and culture and context. The 36 learning outcomes are numbered within each of these strands. This numbering is intended to support teacher planning in the first instance and does not imply any hierarchy of importance across the outcomes themselves, nor does it suggest an order to which the learning outcomes should be developed in class. So let's take a closer look at each of these 3 strands. Here, you will see a brief descriptor of the type of learning that is contained in each of the 3 strands. So to start with innovate and ideate. This strand contains 11 learning outcomes. In developing an awareness of sounds as a potential for generating ideas and communicating feelings, students are given opportunities to draw on their personal experiences and perspectives to develop, refine, and showcase their own musical ideas. To explore fully their musical imagination, creativity, and potential requires students to develop their music literacy and skills in a variety of ways. Our next strand, procedural knowledge, containing 14 learning outcomes, does just that. As you can see, these skills and music literacy are developed to lead to musical understanding. In procedural knowledge, students will develop this musical understanding so that they can pursue and realise their possible musical selves and their ideas with confidence. Our final strand, culture and context, also contains 11 learning outcomes, and as the title suggests, is concerned with developing an understanding of music in past and present contexts and how it is influenced by the culture within which it is created, performed, and listened to. So there are our 3 strands where our 36 learning outcomes reside. It is important to mention at this stage that while the learning outcomes are set out under strand headings, they should not be studied in isolation. The students' engagement and learning are optimized by a fully integrated experience through linking the learning across all 3 strands. To give further emphasis to the nature of this learning, the outcomes for each strand are grouped by reference to 3 elements. And they are creating and exploring, participating and music making, appraising and responding. Elements are about being engaged in the learning process at a deeper level. So to delve a little deeper into each of these elements, creating and exploring focuses on developing students' understanding of how music is created. Students will explore how melody is constructed and layered to create texture and harmony. They will search for and discover themes and ideas for creating music through experimentation, improvisation, and by exploring music concepts and techniques. In the participating and music-making element, students will participate in practical activities that communicate their own creative ideas and the interpretation of others. They will use performance as a method of demonstrating their understanding of music. Appraising and responding allows for discriminatory aural skills to be developed. Appraisal allows the students to express their feelings about music, refine and improve their own performances and creations, respond to and critique other students' work. As stated earlier, the strands should not be studied in isolation. The relationship between these three strands and three elements are clearly annotated in this important message from our specification, which states, engagement and learning are optimized by a fully integrated experience across the three strands and through the integrated nature of learning of the three elements. So now that we have explored where and how our 36 learning outcomes are organized, let's move to our next area of focus, which is based on a frequent question heard during our cluster workshop, which is, how do I unpack a learning outcome? This question has also been asked in other ways, such as, where do I start with a learning outcome? How do I know what to take from a learning outcome? To help us to answer these questions, we must first consider the following. What is a learning outcome? This quotation, taken from our specification, clearly identifies a learning outcome as a statement that describes the knowledge, understanding, skills, and values students should be able to demonstrate having studied music in junior cycle. To break this down further, we can say a learning outcome is what we want our students to know, which is the knowledge and understanding, to be able to do, which is the skills, and to appreciate, which is the value, having studied music in our classrooms. So now we know that the learning is at the heart of every learning outcome. And inherent in this learning is the knowledge, understanding, skills, and values that we want for our students at the end of their 3 years of study. So let's go straight away and unpack a learning outcome. This is a learning outcome taken from our procedural knowledge strand and the creating and exploring element. Take a moment to consider what learning is at the heart of this learning outcome. So students should be able to demonstrate their knowledge, ostinati, rhythm, melody, harmony, phrases, and the purpose of accompaniment. Meanwhile, the understanding is students comprehending how to work with and knowing what to do with this knowledge. Students should be able to demonstrate their skills of composing and performing. Our key skills of working with others, communicating, and managing myself are also clearly activated in this learning. While the value encourages the students' independent thinking, their creativity, and exploration of their own imagination. Now let's go further inside this learning. The underlined words here highlight specific learning concepts of this outcome. This learning requires students to perform a short musical phrase and then create the various ostinati, which can be experienced over a period of time if necessary. working towards a final performance of the musical phrase supported by the accompanying ostinati. We will now hear from our music colleagues from Limerick who attained this learning during one of our cluster workshops. This learning experience that you are about to hear, interestingly, was recorded on a mobile phone. As you listen, keep your eye on the underlined parts of the learning contained in this learning outcome. Many thanks to our colleagues in Limerick for the permission to share that recording tonight with you. So while planning and working with the learning outcomes, it is important to remain cognizant of the principles, statements of learning, and key skills of junior cycle reform, as they informed the development of all our 36 learning outcomes. As a result, the principles, statements of learning, and key skills are given expression through each of the learning outcomes that reside in our specification. As we know, the 8 principles are what underpin the entire junior cycle reform, while the learning required is described in the 24 statements of learning, 6 of which are pertinent to our music specification, and then the 8 key skills exemplify this learning. So if we take a closer look at our learning outcome, the following principles: learning to learn, creativity, engagement and participation are clearly present. In fact, if you were to explore this learning outcome more deeply, you will find all 8 principles are present. With regard to our 6 statements of learning, number 23, the student brings an idea from conception to realization, is very evident, while aspects of number 4 appreciates the process and skills involved, and the numeracy from number 16 are also apparent. If the student chooses to use a device to play back the phrase, then statement of learning 24 is now visible. If you take a moment to consider our key skills, you will find all 8 can be activated through this learning outcome. So while we are not planning explicitly for each of these components of junior cycle reform, it is important to remain cognizant of them when considering the learning. Now that we have explored our specification and unpacked a learning outcome, let's look at some key considerations before planning a unit of learning. These 5 considerations have emerged as a result of the rich professional conversations that have taken place during our cluster workshops. The first, to spend time identifying the learning through reading and getting to know the learning outcomes. Next, link similar learning across the 3 interconnected strands, and try to aim for a balanced spread across the 3 elements. However, don't panic if this is not always possible. Our 4th consideration, Always align the intended learning with the key assessment check-in points. As we now know, Junior Cycle places a strong emphasis on assessment as an integral part of the learning process. It is prudent and valuable to include a reflection piece at the end of every unit of learning. Some of our colleagues advocate taking this step a step further and suggest maintaining a reflective journal, not only to reflect after the unit is completed, but also while the learning is taking place. Connecting to good self-evaluation practices already taking place in our departments. As our department policy will now comprise of living, organic planning documents, this reflection activity, in whatever format you choose it to take, is essential for informing and moving the learning forward. Having spent time identifying the learning through reading and getting to know the learning outcomes, now let us look at how we might link similar learning across the three interconnected strands. We will begin with identifying the learning across two learning outcomes. What might the learning be at the heart of both of these learning outcomes? Take a moment to read 1.6. And now 1.7. We can see that the learning in both learning outcomes deals with the rhythmic and melodic phrases. Rhythmic phrases of up to 4 bars and melodic of up to 2 bars. Although the learning is similar in both learning outcomes, there are nuances in the action required. In 1.6, the students will listen and transcribe, while in 1.7, they will perform at sight. Therefore, when planning, it is important to be mindful of what action verbs are contained in the learning outcomes. And to support you in exploring the learning outcomes through the lens of the action verbs, the music team have put together an action verbs poster. Each action verb is described in terms of what the learner should be able to demonstrate once they have achieved the learning outcome. Also, the learning outcome that uses the action verb is identified and colour-coded to the respective strand. We hope that you find this useful when considering your planning. Now that we have identified the learning across both of these outcomes, let's pause to consider the following message taken from our specification. Engagement and learning are optimised by a fully integrated experience across the three strands. So we should always strive to link the learning across the three interconnected strands. So for the next couple of minutes, let's consider how we might go about doing just that. Returning to our rhythmic and melodic phrases from earlier, we might consider that 4 bars of rhythm and 2 bars of melody would lend themselves very well to the creation of ostinati. Take a look at 2.6. Would the learning here complement the learning already evidenced in 1.6 and 1.7? Yes, it does. You can see that the added layers of learning here in 2.6 are around texture, program music, and the emotional response to a film clip or a sequence of images. You will also notice that 2.6 is taken from our Innovate and Ideate strand, thus linking the learning across the strands. Here we have linked the learning across 3 of the learning outcomes. Would it be possible to add more? The very first learning outcome we unpacked tonight, our love cats. Could this earlier identified learning be linked to the learning experience here? We are now linking the short musical phrases to the rhythmic and melodic ostinati and our rhythmic and melodic phrases. The new learning that we are adding here is the harmonic ostinato and the concept of accompanying. We have now linked the learning across 4 learning outcomes. However, have we integrated the learning across all 3 strands? as jingles can consist of short musical phrases. Consider 3.4. We are now looking at the music industry through music used in advertising. Also, we are now integrating technology as a learning tool, as the students will record their compositions. Ultimately, we have identified the learning in 5 learning outcomes and linked this learning across the 3 interconnected strands, thus taking the first steps towards building a unit of learning. Now, we do appreciate that this can be very overwhelming, so let's take a couple of minutes to hear what comments and questions have been coming in, and I'm going to ask Ethel to join me to talk about those. So Ethel, what comments and questions have been coming in from our listeners tonight?
Thanks, Michelle, and hello everybody again. Some really valuable information covered there, Michelle, and there are lots of questions coming in surrounding particularly the linking of the learning there. But before I go through some of those questions, I'd really, Michelle, some of the comments that are coming in from our earlier question are really just fantastic. So I'm going to take a moment to share these with you. Just a gentle reminder, our question was, what aspect of the music specification are you most looking forward to engaging with? So a big shout out to Fiona, you were first in, no more set songs. And in actual fact, that has come through quite a lot of the answers. The first comment that came in after Fiona then said probably a little bit more succinctly and spoke about the choice and flexibility to choose our own songs and to choose our own content. A lot of you are really looking forward to the composition. It's fantastic to see the huge number of responses applauding our classroom-based assessments, and in particular the biggest message that seems to be coming from there is the fact that they're going to be part of everyday music classes. This comment, Michelle, I really like, and it's cropped up in so many different ways, but to make it really short from this particular colleague, she says, what I'm really looking forward to is making music just more real for our students. Similar to this, other colleagues are talking about the new areas of learning, creation of jingles, the found sounds. Can I tell you guys, there hasn't been a cluster workshop that hasn't cropped up. So there's great excitement and great interest around our found sounds. A guy got to you there before you mentioned it, Michelle, about music in the industry and spoke about music in advertising. Let me just look here. There's a couple more comments around that topic. Delighted to see the music industry finally present in our music curriculum, not just in the recording techniques, not just in the studio effects, but in that really important sharing and publishing of music. The awareness, our colleague says, the awareness of plagiarism and copyright, this is so important for our young people to know. Quite a few of our colleagues, and I just recognize the names, so I know you're all from the beautiful county of Donegal. Quite a few of our colleagues are looking forward to the opportunities, to quote, the opportunities to explore music within the local and national context, and they're absolutely delighted to see the mention of Irish composers and songwriters in our learning outcomes. And as you know, Michelle, we all know that in those learning outcomes, there are no specific mention of names of songwriters or composers. So you are in a position to choose the songwriters and composers that are most relevant to you and your school context. So I think you'll agree, Michelle, there's some really fantastic,
valid questions.
Yeah, some really fabulous contributions there. So thank you, everybody. There are just so many. That was just a scratching of the iceberg, really. I think appropriate, the iceberg that we traveled to get here today. So we will share maybe the other responses with you and with everybody else attending after our webinar is finished. Now, to take a look at some of your questions, I suppose the first question in does ask around the planning, and there are quite a number of questions around planning. When planning in September, do I have to incorporate all of the strands when putting the learning outcomes together? And I think, to be fair, that question came in before, Michelle, you had a chance to actually deal with it. So just to reiterate, the specification states that the learning will be optimized by a fully integrated experience across the 3 strands. So I suppose really, yes, you are aiming to connect. Michelle, there's a couple of questions, as I say, around this across the 3 strands issue. And it seems to be, there seems to be a worry out there that it may not be possible to link them across the strands, or some people are finding it really difficult to link the learning across the strands. So can we suggest here as part of your team, and just to reassure everyone, that once you spend time identifying the learning, reading the learning outcomes, you will absolutely begin to find the fluid links in the learning across the strands. Another very pertinent question, and again it's cropped up a good bit, what happens with the sampling? My first years sample music for 8 weeks before they choose their subjects. Can I use the learning outcomes from the new specifications during this taster module, or do I have to leave them out? I think what that question is asking, can they use the learning outcomes from the new specification? And we would absolutely say yes, why not? Experiencing the learning outcomes through a sampler or a taster module would give the students a real expectation of the learning and the rich music learning that would be happening in your future junior cycle classes. I'll just take one more, Michelle, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
I missed the training this year as I didn't know anything about it. How and where do I sign up? Well, I suppose really to answer that, principals are asked to register their teachers for CPD, so maybe just check in with your principal. It's quite possible you haven't had it yet, simply because the rollout hasn't finished. It won't be finished for another fortnight. But just to let all of you know, for those of you who have music as your second subject, we will be running this year's CPD again in the autumn for you. So you will get the opportunity to engage with it then. So I'm going to tune out for now, Michelle, and go back to the questions, and I'll pass it all over to you for the next section. Thanks
Michelle.
Thanks
for that, Ethel. And remember to keep posting your questions and comments throughout the webinar. So let's now start to look at some practical strategies to help us start planning for September 2018. Throughout this section of the webinar, we will also provide some suggested templates that could help you with your planning. These will be available to download on our website in editable form, so please feel free to tweak, change, and most importantly, make them your own and relevant to your own school context. As we are now all aware, the 36 learning outcomes set out in the specification represent the outcomes for our students at the end of their 3 years of music. As the quote states, the learning outcomes are for 3 years, and therefore learning outcomes focused on at a point in time will not have been completed, but continue to support the students' learning up to the end of junior cycle. Therefore, the students will engage with some of the learning across the 36 learning outcomes in first year. This learning will be revisited and engaged with at a much deeper level in second year, with the full realization of the intended learning of all of the learning outcomes being attained in third year. So taking all the areas we have focused on so far in this webinar, i.e. engaging with our specification, how to unpack a learning outcome, the key considerations to keep in mind when starting to plan, and the linking of the learning across the 3 strands, let's put all this knowledge together and start planning. Having identified the learning in all 36 learning outcomes, you will then link that learning across the 3 strands into, say, 6 units that will take place throughout the year. These 6 units could happen like this: September to Halloween, Halloween to Christmas, Christmas to midterm, midterm to St. Patrick's Day, St. Patrick's Day to Easter, and Easter to June. Some teachers prefer to plan for 5 units, and we will show you a suggested planning tool you could use for this approach later in the webinar. Whichever number you decide, here is a graphic organizer to help you link your learning of the 36 learning outcomes into the required number of units. Here is an example of 2 of these linking learning units completed. Once you have populated all 6 units with the 36 learning outcomes, here are 2 possible ways that you can approach this planning. The first, if the learning in these units was successful for your students, you can decide to stick with these units throughout the 3 years and layer the learning appropriately along that journey. Your departmental conversation, informed by your reflections on each unit, will support you in deciding on this approach. The second, when you return to the departmental conversation to decide on the intended learning for second year, you might reflect as a department that maybe this wasn't the best mix of learning outcomes for those particular students. If this is your conversation, you may keep in mind which aspects of the learning outcomes you achieved in first year, and then decide either to further develop these learning outcomes or blend them with different learning outcomes from another unit. Now that you have linked the learning across the 3 strands, you will need to identify the intended learning for first years. Take a moment to consider the learning outcomes taken from our graphic organisers. Looking at learning outcomes 2.7, 1.11, 2.2, 1.2 and 3.1. Let's consider what the intended learning might be for first years. The underlined words could be the suggested intended learning. Here is a 1-year planning tool to support you. You will see here we have our 6 units where the intended learning will reside, and beneath this row you will see another row where you will evidence this learning, and we will deal with this aspect shortly in the webinar. So we have linked learning from our graphic organizer. We have identified the intended learning for first years with the underlined words. Now we position this intended learning into our 1-year planner like this. So the suggested learning here is that our first years, over a number of weeks, will present a musical idea using instruments and/or found sounds in response to a stimulus such as a local historical event. They will also learn about form in music through illustrating the structure through a visual representation. Now you will need to evidence this learning. As part of your departmental conversation, when you are identifying the intended learning, you should also aim to align the evidence of learning with this identified learning at the same time. So the evidence of learning are the opportunities given to students to demonstrate what they know, understand, and are able to do with the intended learning. Evidence of learning are the rich tasks that take place through formative moments in the classroom, and summative moments are 4 key assessment check-ins, which demonstrate the learning has taken place throughout the 3 years. Take a look at what the specification has to say in relation to assessment. When aligning the intended learning with the key assessment check-ins, consider the following quote from page 19 of our specification. The junior cycle places a strong emphasis on assessment as part of the learning process. This requires a more varied approach to assessment in ensuring that the assessment method or methods chosen are fit for purpose, timely, and relevant to the students. Essentially, the purpose of assessment is to support learning. So therefore, essentially the purpose of assessment is to support the learning, assessment as learning. In fully considering these 2 statements then, There should be lots of moments across the 3 years to be gathering evidence of learning from our students. Let's take a look at this learning journey. What do these 4 key assessment check-ins consist of? Everything we do in junior cycle music is to support the student learning. The assessment of music for the purpose of the Junior Cycle Profile of Achievement, or JCPA, will comprise 2 classroom-based assessments, a composition portfolio, and a programme note, a practical examination, and a final written examination. These 4 summative moments are distinct markers in the student's learning journey, while still being an integral part of ongoing assessment and routine classroom practice. In this way, they will form part of the formative assessment that occurs in the ebb and flow of classroom interaction that occurs every day in class. In the case of the classroom-based assessments, the teacher's judgment is recorded for the purpose of subject learning and assessment review, and for the purpose of reporting to parents and students. The State Examinations Commission will assess both the practical and final written examination in 3rd year. Now that we have identified the intended learning for the year and have aligned it with our evidence of learning, we want to plan deeper into each unit of learning. Here is a suggested planning tool to support you with this, and let's go through it. So, learning outcomes. These come from our graphic organiser, where we linked the learning across the 3 strands and we plotted our 36 learning outcomes into the required number of units. The intended learning is what is the learning we want our students to know by the end of this unit. Learning experiences is how this learning will take place. Evidence of learning is how we know this learning has taken place. And after that, we document what resources we will use, and the importance of this reflection piece, as we already have discussed, cannot be understated. So to recap, step 1 involves linking the learning across the 36 learning outcomes and plotting into 5 or 6 units. Step 2 consists of identifying the learning for a particular year group and aligning the evidence of that learning at the same time. Step 3 is concerned with planning more deeply inside each of the intended learning units. We do appreciate there is a lot of information to take in there. So to reiterate, this webinar will be made available on our website to download in the coming days. So over to Ethel now for some questions, some further questions, I suppose, that have been coming in. So Ethel, what's happening on the question front?
Well, a lot of comments, Michelle, coming in around our suggested planning templates. Guys, we hope you find them helpful, but they are there for you to tweak, to pull aside, to pull asunder. Please make them your own and make them relevant to your own school context. So comment in is thank you so much to the team for putting all of these templates together. They will be really helpful. However, in capital letters, when will I be able to download them? So these templates, to reassure you, will be available along with the webinar. As Michelle just said, they'll be uploaded to our website in the coming days. Another question around the planning is, do I have to use these templates? And I think I'm probably answering it a second time. Not at all, folks. You can design whatever planning templates you want, as long as your planning answers these following questions. And these are really important questions. What is the learning? How will that learning take place? And most importantly, how do I know that the learning has taken place? And around that then, of course, include your reflection piece there, or as Michelle said, there were some of our colleagues who felt that a reflective journal would be much more supportive And certainly, as Michelle also suggested there, when you're linking your learning outcomes across the 36 learning outcomes, and then you come back in second year and you have that departmental conversation, that's where your reflections will really come into play. And that will decide and inform you moving forward, identifying the learning with your second years. So there are lots of questions coming in around the practical. Maybe it's the time of year, so we will take a couple of these, although you are aware that the practical will be very different for the new junior cycle. It will now be 30%, and the children will engage and perform 3 pieces. So one of our questions here states, I heard that students can do a sight reading rhythm for their unprepared test. Is this right? So folks, if you go to page 23 of your specification, you'll see it states there, students will take an unprepared test. They will choose from oral memory, rhythmic or melodic, sight reading, instrumental, vocal or rhythmic, or improvisation. So I think it's fairly clear there that the rhythmic sight reading is included. Another question, Michelle, around the practical is, can my students play acoustic and electric guitar and bass guitar for their practical? Again, folks, you'll find this answer on page 23 of the specification, where it says, these 3 songs or pieces may also be presented on a variety of instruments or through a combination of voice and instruments. So that really is self-explanatory there. Other questions that's coming in, this one is very real actually. I'm finding it hard to come to terms with the lack of prescribed materials. While I welcome this new specification and I'm genuinely delighted with it, I do, however, feel very isolated. Can I please use some of the resources that I have been using up until now? So can I say to you, the JCT music team, we always try to reassure people and our colleagues when we meet with you and work with you to acknowledge that it is overwhelming and it is and can be very challenging sometimes because it is revolutionary. But can I suggest to you, don't try and do it in a vacuum. Talk to each other, talk to the music team. And to specifically answer your question there, if you have resources that work for you and have worked for you in the past, and you find that those resources will help you achieve the optimal learning that needs to happen for those learning outcomes to be achieved, well, then we don't see any problem with you using those resources again. Our final question, Michelle, that I'm going to take, and again, this one is very pertinent. It's come up from teachers who are subbing, teachers who are on all sorts of contracts, but fundamentally it states, I'm a single music teacher department. Will this new specification give me the opportunity to meet with other music teachers? So folks, to answer this question, I'm going to quote the framework, which says, the new junior cycle recognises the importance of not just professional development, but collaboration between teachers for informing their understanding of teaching, learning and assessment and their practice in the classroom. And this isn't always easy when we do find ourselves as single subject teachers. So we would advocate, try to connect maybe with other music teachers in your area, maybe other music teachers that you've met in your JCT cluster workshops, possibly music teachers that you know from going to the national conference with the subject association, or what one colleague, Michelle, has just sent in to me. What she has set up is a WhatsApp group with all of her friends that she did the HDIP with 16 years ago. So that is creative, beyond creative. So folks, I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to pass back to Michelle to finish out.
Okay. So the last area of tonight's webinar is entitled Suggested Next Steps. Well, our first suggestion is get the conversation going. The Junior Cycle Framework, as Ethel already stated, recognises the importance of professional development and collaboration between teachers. So you could begin with a departmental conversation where together you link the learning across a number of learning outcomes from across the strands. Next, decide how the evidence of learning might be aligned and gathered. Having agreed as a department the key learning and key check-ins, the learning experiences can be discussed at department level if you wish, or the individual teacher can decide on the activities or learning experiences that will best meet his or her students' needs. In this case, the content in every single classroom selected by individual teachers could be different, but they are still exploring the same learning outcomes. The teachers then come back to the department and give feedback. By reflecting, refining, and adapting their approaches, they move forward, more informed and with better understanding, and the cycle begins again. The learning outcomes and action verbs posters will scaffold and inform all of your planning. Our statements of learning and key skills posters show how music is linked to central features of learning and teaching outlined in the framework for Junior Cycle 2015. Our suggested planning tools, which we presented to you tonight throughout this webinar. The added blue template is for those of you who wish to plan through a 1-year, 5-unit planner. To reiterate, these will all be uploaded to the music section of our website in editable form so you can tweak and amend them to make it feel real for your own school context. These are your go-to documents for all things Junior Cycle. The framework and music specification are available to download from both our website and on curriculumonline.ie. The Circular 15/2017 will keep you informed of any updates with regard to Junior Cycle. It also contains information on professional time and how it is apportioned, and it is available on the department's website, education.ie. You can see here that this is where you can find the music specification. And also, when our assessment guidelines are published, they will be uploaded here. And we are expecting these to be published before the summer. For planning, resources, and anything around the area of support, you will find this on our music section of the JCT website. Music has its own page where you can access key documents, news, events, locate CPD workshops, resources, events, and planning. All of the posters, resources, and planning templates spoken about during this webinar will be available here. In addition, if you have any queries or questions, you can get in touch with us at info@jct.ie, join our mailing list and Twitter feed so you are kept up to date with all of the latest information and news. So I would like to once again invite Ethel back to conclude the webinar.
Thanks very much, Michelle. I suppose really and truly, guys, thank you for your participation with all those questions throughout our webinar this evening. But I'd like to finish, if you don't mind, with the voice of our specification. And it tells us that music education in the new Junior Cycle reform supports the development of the whole person, is intrinsically motivating, meaningful and rewarding, offers lifelong opportunities to develop the imagination, and if those of us who remember John Painter, the imagination in our young people is a direct link to their intellect. Music education in Junior Cycle enables individuality and personality to be given a voice, and let's not forget who we are doing it for. The student voice is absolutely crucial and so important. Music education in Junior Cycle develops new skills while drawing on previous experiences, fosters music-specific skills and a range of transferable skills for lifelong learning and those jobs that just have not been created yet. Fundamentally, guys, I don't need to tell you, but the new Junior Cycle reform and music education in that reform develops future citizens who are culturally aware, culturally engaged, and culturally connected. It encourages the development of responsible and ethical citizens. So to finish up tonight, thank you for your participation, not just this evening, but from the many rich, valuable, and just fun times that we've had out during our cluster workshops. Can I say on your behalf a huge word of thanks to my colleagues and the music team for all their hard work to date. What's next? Well, let's keep the conversation going. We're really looking forward to meeting you and working with you again in our upcoming CPD days. For now, Hook the Clog, Ganyari and Talev, agus EY.